Welcome to the Black Male Impact. Today, we have as guest Dr. Marvin Lynn. And I can tell you, Dr. Lynn have been serving in education for almost 30 years. And I can tell you that's more than commendable because in a time when we are trying to have more Black men in the classroom, to see someone who have been serving so long in the classroom, you can see or say that he's dedicated to education and to help others to become the best version of themselves. Dr. Lynn, welcome to the Black Male Impact.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. But before we get into the conversation itself, or before I start asking you any questions, I would ask you to please share about yourself and what you want the audience or the listeners to know before we get into the conversation.
Yes. So I am currently serving as the dean and a professor in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Colorado, Denver. I've actually only recently started this position. I started this July, so I'm new to this community. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, very modest background, and so I didn't have a lot of folks to look to who were in these types of roles in my community. And so but I did dream as a young kid about becoming a teacher, becoming a leader at some point. And so I went on to go to DePaul University in Chicago to get a bachelor's degree and to become an elementary teacher. My goal at that time was to become a teacher. And I was interested in teaching at the elementary levels. I also have a background in music. And so I got licensed to teach music K-12. I went on from there to get graduate degrees and ended up in higher education, where I've been since 2001. So I'm celebrating two decades in higher education. And half that time, I've been in leadership as a dean for the last, this is my 9th year as a dean. And so I was a dean at 2 other places, at Indiana University, South Bend, and at Portland State University most recently, both in schools or colleges of education. And so I've come up through the ranks as a teacher in the K-12 environment, and then as a higher education professor, conducting research on Black male teachers, and then as a leader in higher education, which is the role I occupy today.
Okay, man, that's awesome. That is awesome. But even before the conversation starts, really, what are some of the books you have written and the impact from your books?
So I've written one book, and I can't even say I've written it. I'm the editor of the lead editor of the book, called The Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education.
Okay.
And the first edition of that book came out in 2013 on Routledge Press. And the second edition was recently released in 2021. So very timely, given the national conversation around critical race theory.
Yeah.
And I would say the impact of that book, it's a handbook, and it's a large book with 32 substantive chapters, and it's expensive. But a lot of folks who are trying to study these issues in graduate school, for example, rely on that book as a source. And so a lot of libraries, particularly university libraries, will publish the book, or order the book, I should say, so that students and professors on their campuses can have access to it. So I think it's really been a resource for people who are really trying to understand and study how critical race theory can be used in the field of education.
Yes, and you said, as you mentioned, that it's timely because that's the topic since 2020 or 2021. It has been a big part of the conversation when it comes to students and progress and how, the direction of the education system. So thanks for sharing that. And I want to dive into the questions. I know once we start the conversation, we'll go more into some of the work that you have been doing. But let me start off by asking, what is the mindset that it takes to make a positive impact?
That's a great question. It's different, I'm sure, for everybody. For me, it's about really wanting to see change happen, being uncomfortable with things being the same, particularly if people are oppressed, if there's injustice in the environment in some way. As an educator who was teaching African American male children in schools that people didn't necessarily want to invest in or want to support, I saw a lot of things in that environment that made me want to change the educational system on behalf of African American children, right? And so I was restless in terms of trying to see how I could make a difference. And one of the reasons I left K-12 teaching to go into higher education is I thought that perhaps I would be able to make a greater impact as a researcher and as a leader, preparing teachers to teach, and that I would be able to have more impact there. So for me, it was about the restlessness. It was about not being satisfied with the current condition that I was in and that I find my people in, and wanting to seek to change that. It's also the mindset, I think, outside of restlessness and sort of feeling like you've got to somehow initiate change. You have to be willing to roll up your sleeves and do the hard work that it takes to see something through. I guess a level of patience is required. I'll have to admit, I'm not always the most patient person, and so I'm working on that, right? In terms of being more patient and understanding that sometimes change takes time, and not being as restless as I think I probably was at a point in my life. And so one has to be ready to engage and do the work that is necessary in order to initiate change, and then you have to be willing to kind of see it through. And so that level of patience, I think, is required there.
And I do appreciate it. But you say one thing that I've never really heard or I can recall: be uncomfortable with things remaining the same.
Right.
So having the desire to create change is important, but sometimes, as you mentioned, we have to be willing to initiate the change that we see needs to happen. And
Right.
sometimes, if we don't do that, change may not happen, because sometimes we are the ones who see the need for change.
Right. Right.
And we may be thinking that others may have seen it, but maybe they don't, or maybe they don't feel comfortable taking that first step. So
Right.
once, as you mentioned, we have the desire, we should go forth to make those change happen.
The other thing I'll say, because you talked about impact, and this is the thing I've learned along the way as a leader in particular, and sometimes we as change makers, as people who want to sort of see change happen, we forget that it's very important for us to engage with our community, to engage with the people that are going to be impacted by that change that you're trying to make, right? Because you have to do this in a collaborative, cooperative way if it really is going to have impact. And you have to be sure that the impact on the people that you're trying to help is going to be a positive and productive one. Because all too often, we step out there and do something on our own without really engaging folks, without really asking them what it is they need or want, and without checking with them around process. And we sometimes do more harm than good, even though our intention is to do good. And so as a leader, I've learned along the way that it's very, very important for me to carry folks with me as I begin this process of engaging in change, and to try to understand what their needs are, what their thoughts are about what the process or the approach should be, and what ultimately they want to see happen on their behalf.
I really appreciate that, and that's well received perspective. Always think about the people
Mm-hmm.
that we are creating the change for, and how it will impact them, because it may be good for those who are making the change, but it
Mm-hmm.
may not be as beneficial for those who will be impacted
That's right.
with the change. So I really appreciate that. And,
Mm-hmm.
and and I hope the listeners are taking notes, because you're up for a treat.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say my next question. This conversation is mostly focusing on what we need to do as Black men, and how we can play a role in positive change. So, what advice do you have for the men listening on how they can play a role in creating positive change?
That's a great question. When you ask that question about Black men, I think about being a father, right? And I think about the relationship that I have with my children, three young men, ages 14, 17, and 20. And what it takes for me as a parent, and if you're a parent, you know it can be challenging with kids that age, because they're developing their own mind, And in fact, they are naturally rejecting some of the teachings, right, that you taught them, and beginning to question some things. And so, what advice would I give to Black men? I would say be present, be engaged, and be prepared to have your intentions, your ideas, your person, have all those things be questioned at times, right? Because when you're trying to make a difference, not everybody understands your intention, not everybody sees your heart, and so you have to develop those relationships, and you have to stay close to people so that they understand, and you have to listen. I think it's very important to listen to where people are and what it is they need, just like I was saying before, and to really be engaged on the ground level in terms of understanding, well, if I do this, how is it really going to impact the people around me, and how do I ensure that this has a positive impact, and how do I engage people in the conversations around what it is what that next thing ought to be, as far as what we're trying to get to. What is our vision, right? Our collective vision. Can we develop that together? And I think we do that in families. I think we do that in communities. We do that in universities, right, or schools, or wherever you might work. I think the other thing I want to say really quickly, just
Yes.
as Black men, and we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, we do have some unique kinds of things that we're facing in this country, and I would say all over the world, given the situation that we find ourselves in socially, politically, economically, and so on, right? And
Yes.
so I do believe that Black men have an extra burden to bear, and that is racism. There's a term misandry, but there's the way in which Black adults or Black men are viewed in pretty negative ways. And so we have to understand that is a part of the context in which we are doing our work, whether it be fathering or leading or teaching or being a doctor or whatever it is. And that is always going to shape how we're treated, how we're responded to. And we have to develop the understanding that we can't internalize it, right? It's not about us, that there are these systemic factors that shape how we're viewed and how we're seen, but that is more about them than it is about us. And I think that frees us so that we can do the work that we need to do despite the context. And then hopefully we can help improve and shape the context to be a little bit more inclusive and open to us and others.
Yes. And to go back up a little bit from what you shared, once we decide that we're going to create change, and that's something that even when you said it, I'm really thinking about it, where we have to understand that those around us may not understand from where we're coming, and they may not understand our heart. So sometimes it's on us to try to build that relationship,
Right.
so people can understand where we're coming from. We're not trying to do something that's going to really affect those around us in a negative way.
Right.
But if they don't understand us, sometimes it's on us to help them to understand what we are trying to do. Because again, from the systemic part of what we're dealing with, sometimes we're approaching it like we want this to be done because it's affecting us, but the people may not understand from our perspective. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And not only that what you said, I'm kind of processing everything so I can really give the right response to what you shared. But it really put things in context. Once you start to look at the things that's happening around us as Black men. So it's not just having the idea to create change, but it's
Right.
also for us to look at what else we're dealing with, the
Right.
perception that people have of us, because
Right.
you can have the right intentions, but everyone may not receive what we are trying to do how we think they should, because they're looking at us based on how they have been conditioned, based on what they may have experienced when it comes to us as Black men. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I know it sheds some light, especially for change agents as ourselves, that people who want to make a difference, it kind of put things in perspective. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And my next question, and these questions kind of overlap, so you may have to say some things more than once. It's just to kind of build on what the conversation is about, and to let others, because they may miss a point at the beginning. So The next question is, how can we, as Black men, help to change the narrative today?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because when you say the narrative, I'm thinking about the narrative that suggests that Black men are dangerous or violent and not worth much, right? And that our lives don't matter. And all of these ideas that I think are put out there in the public media, but that are also evident in terms of the curriculum, and is, we're missing from the curriculum, right? So when you're not in the history books, what that suggests is, you're not only invisible, but you don't matter, you're not important. And so we get treated that way. How do we change the narrative? Part of it for me has been about research and has been about writing, and putting different narratives into the universe, right? So that there's different stories. So like I started my career as a teacher in the elementary school, and I was very curious about why there weren't other Black teachers like me. I didn't know the literature at the time. I didn't know what the data suggested. I didn't really know that we were 2% of the population, right, of educators. But I knew that we weren't present in the schools that I had attended as a student and that I taught in. I also knew that Black lives were devalued within that context. And so I was very interested in how that was impacting teachers. And so I began to read the literature on teachers and teaching. And I saw in that literature that we were not there either. We were missing. And then the literature that was available on Black male teachers mostly emphasized women educators, with some slight nods to Black men, but not enough to be able to understand what they were facing in the classroom. And then there was other literature that talked about Black male teachers as negative influences in the classroom for Black children. And so I thought to myself, there must be another story here, right? And I took it really as my responsibility to, as you say, change the narrative about Black male teachers. And so I sought out in my research Black male teachers who were doing positive things and were seeking to have a positive impact on students in their communities. And I found them. And I spent a significant amount of time with them, understanding their lives and what motivated them to teach, and then watching and observing their classroom practices. And so I built my academic career around telling the stories around Black male teachers who were really doing great work in the schools. But I also built relationships with those educators and shared with them the writings as they were being published and so on. But also began to shift the narrative around Black male teachers and what impact they could potentially have and why they were important and valuable. And now what I see, and I'm not saying it's because of my work, I think there are a number of other people who have done this work too, but what I do see in our environment is a number of national, state, and local organizations that are focused on the recruitment and retention of Black male teachers. And that didn't exist when I started doing this research a couple of decades ago. And so I would like to think that the work that I did in this space, along with other people like Anthony Brown and Ed Brockenbrough and other scholars, helped to lay the groundwork for these organizations and these communities to come together and say, this is valuable and important, and we're going to support it. And so in a very real way, I think I helped to change the narrative about Black male teachers. And then as a result, created a groundswell of support at multiple levels for this population of folks to enter into the classroom. Now, are they in the classrooms in the numbers that they should be? Absolutely not. But I think there's a movement afoot that it makes me hopeful. And these are young people who are leading these movements to focus on the recruitment and retention of Black male teachers. And so I'm excited by that. And again, feeling like I played maybe some small role in making that happen.
Okay, yes, sir. And let me see, where should I start with the response that you gave? I really like that you take on the challenge yourself by being a part of the solution. But as you mentioned, that to change the narrative comes with taking responsibility.
Right.
And if we're going to, as Black men, I think it boils down to taking responsibility to the area that we see fit, where we can make a difference. Because it may not be teaching, it could be to join the police, the justice system, become a police officer, or become an entrepreneur, whatever it is, or wherever it is. But you said it right, to change the narrative boils down to us taking responsibility. And if it's to be an advocate in our community, if it's to be there in our family to support our family, whatever it is that we see the needs, wherever the needs are, it boils down to taking responsibility if we're going to change the narrative.
And I'll say too, I know a lot of young men who are heavily influenced by their father, and even if their father wasn't in their lives, they hear stories about who their father was, and they're very, very, very shaped by that, right? And so I know of a situation where there's a very talented young man in my family who is bright, really smart, and capable, but who has a father who has had a history of drug abuse and drug dealing and just, gangs and so on. And it felt to me, as I was trying to sort of bring him along, that he was so shaped and influenced by that narrative of who his father was that he couldn't get away. It's like he couldn't escape it. And he felt like he was condemned to relive the same narrative. And we kept saying, no, you have the opportunity to shape this narrative the way you want to shape it. We want to help you move in a different direction. And sometimes it's really hard for us to see ourselves as being set apart and different from our fathers if our fathers are not positive influences. In my case, my father was killed when I was 3 years old.
Oh, wow.
So I didn't have the opportunity to be influenced by him directly. But what's interesting about my father is that he was a man who was very complicated, right? As far as what I hear from family. And he was a minister. He was a community leader at some point. He had a thirst for knowledge and for education. And he was a talented speaker and all those things. And so those were the things that my immediate family and my mother's family chose to share with me about my dad.
Okay.
It wasn't later that I met my sister, my older sister on my dad's side, that I began to hear stories about some other sides of my dad, some violent tendencies and alcoholism and things like that, right? And I thank God that I didn't hear about that side of him as I was growing up as a kid, because I don't know how that would have shaped me, right, in terms of my identity. But my identity was shaped by this idea of this man who was a preacher, a smart man, a capable guy, man, who owned property, somebody well respected in the community. And so I could kind of fashion myself after what I believe to be a really positive image of my dad. And so it's important the stories we tell to kids about who their parents are, if kids don't know their parents. But if kids know their parents, then I think we have to give them the option or the opportunity to sort of move in a different direction without denigrating the image of who that person is, their parent.
Man, that is well said. Because when we're dealing with young people today, especially like in the college setting, sometimes we see certain behavior. And you're right. Sometimes as leaders or those who are serving these students, put the students down. And then it hurts them even more when our duty and responsibility should help them to change the way they see themselves, because they're operating from a narrative that they have seen.
Right.
And it's on us, and it can be hard, as you mentioned, to help them to change from how they have been conditioned to see themselves, because it's easier for us to become what we see. And if they see things that are not positive, the environment they come from, the parents, their neighbors, whoever around them, show up as the labels that society talks about, then that's a part of their mind, is to help them. And as you were talking and sharing that story, and you have heard the good part of your dad, and then later you have heard other negative things. And I see where, as leaders today, it comes down to helping those who may not have that positive foundation, where mentorship comes in. Help these young men, especially, to change the perception they have of themselves by having more positive influence around them, being that example, so they can now see something different, and hopefully they change the perception of self, because I believe it starts in the mind. And once they have the mindset change, anything will be possible.
Well, I'll tell you, like I said, I grew up, I said modest means, but quite frankly, we were poor. And my mother went through periods of time where she was on welfare. So, I mean, we were poor kids struggling on the south side of Chicago and then later on the near north side. But one of the things that made a big difference for me is, like I said, I didn't have anybody telling me that my dad was a bad person. And I think, again, when we do that to children, it damages their self-esteem because they see themselves in their dad and vice versa, right? So that we got to stop doing that and withhold negative stuff. I mean, they did it to me. They didn't tell me the negative stuff, and I'm glad they didn't. And as an adult, I can deal with that. I understand that. But the other thing I'll say is I had family members around me consistently telling me that I was going to be great, that I was going to accomplish something good, that I was going to be a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher, right? And in their minds, all those were great options for me, and that I had all these opportunities that I could pursue. And so from the very start of my life, I had this idea that I could be something, that I could accomplish something. And so I wasn't defined by my circumstances, which were poor and sometimes dangerous. And I mean, there are all the things that happen, right, in communities where we lack resources, right? I experienced on some level. But what was consistent is that I had people who believed in me and let me know that. And then I ran into teachers in school who had that same belief that, yeah, you're gonna accomplish something one day. And so that belief that I could be a dean or be a teacher or whatever never wavered. And it had a lot to do with the adults around me who in many ways struggled themselves, right, with issues in their own lives, but had enough wisdom to understand that if I pour into this kid and convince him that he's going to be somebody, maybe he'll turn out okay.
That is something. When we're thinking about creating change, when we're thinking about changing the narrative, when we're thinking about helping to shape the future, we have to be intentional with pouring what we want the next generation to think about when it comes to who they are, who they can be, and their options.
Right.
And man, that is so, so important. What you just said cannot be stressed too much if we're going to change the narrative. And being that you started off your journey in an unfavorable situation, you're born into poverty, you didn't have all the resources, and yet they make it their point of duty to tell you all the good things that you can become. And men, we have to do that. And it's not only to immediate family, but the people who are in our environment and those we are entrusted to serve or help or support. It is very important that we speak positive things, even if you don't know how they're going to plant that seed of
Right.
positivity in their mind. So, Dr. Lynn, I appreciate you sharing that. And it's a great reminder to everyone, because at times on the journey, sometimes we forget maybe life, but we have to make that become a natural part of who we are. So when we're in situation, what's going to come from us is positive.
Right. The other thing I'll say about my own experience, and I try to take these lessons into my own life today, is my parents and my stepfather, who I was never close to, and my mom. And again, they had their struggles and their issues, right? But my stepfather came from a middle class family. And even though he had a lot of struggles of his own and wasn't living that life, he made sure to take us around his family. So I was in the company of educators, right? And people who owned homes and were living a certain lifestyle, and my siblings too. And I think about it today. All of my siblings on my mom's side and we all own homes today. We all have families. We all have, long-term marriages and relationships that we're in. And so we were all influenced by the people that weren't necessarily living the way we were, but living in a different way. And to be honest with you, when you're a poor kid hanging around with middle class people, they look down on you, right? And so we experienced that, but we also got an opportunity to see what life would be like. I'll never forget when I was 7, 8 years old, my stepfather's brother-in-law would write us a check every year for Christmas,
Wow.
right? And so, but that was the only opportunity that I had to see somebody write a check, because
That's
in
right.
my household, there were no checkbooks, right? There were no bank accounts. And so I got exposed to that, and they were intentional about exposing us to that. And we didn't know at the time that that's what they were doing. But what it did was it gave us a different way, a different vision, different understanding about what life could be like for us.
That's powerful. That is powerful. Now it's our responsibility to expose the next generation to
Right.
what they can become. And
Right.
that leads me to this question. Who and what has influenced or inspired you to pursue the path that you're on, being that you're in education? I know you've mentioned something earlier, but please, if you could share who or what inspired you.
From as early as I can recall, I wanted to be a teacher, and I don't know if that had to do with my step aunt, right, who was an educator. In fact, my step aunt taught at the school that I attended and was my teacher at one point, right? And so I got to sort of understand who she was as a teacher in the classroom, but then I also got to go to her house and see her with a mimeograph machine and all the things that you had to do in the 70s, right, to prepare to teach. And so I kind of felt like I got to understand firsthand what teaching was all about. And I decided, yeah, this is what I want to do. And maybe it was because of that. I also had the good fortune of having absolutely fantastic African American teachers all throughout my entire educational journey, from kindergarten through the PhD, right? Just having these teachers who invested in me and had that same belief, yeah, you're going to be good, right? When I went to get my master's at Columbia in New York, I ran into an African American educator, Dr. Barbara Wallace, who said, "When are you getting your doctorate?" I said,
Wow.
"What?" I was just there to get a master's so I could be a better teacher. I hadn't thought about a doctorate. And of course, what she knew is that once she asked me that question, I wouldn't stop thinking about it.
That's right. That's right.
And it was a couple of years later that I was in a doctoral program, right? And so educators all along the way have inspired me to do what I do, and have done at multiple levels. And in many ways, and if you listen to interviews of me in other places or read any of my reflective writing, you'll see me say the same thing over and over again. And that is that for me, being engaged in education, one of the ways it was one of the important things about it was being able to give back to my community, but also being able to repay somehow the gifts that those teachers gave to me, and to try to do the same thing for other people. So paying it forward, as they say, was really the goal. But yeah, absolutely, it was teachers, it was educators. I've also growing up in Chicago,
Yeah.
had the opportunity to be influenced by great political leaders, Black men who were, as I saw them, beacons, right, of integrity, who were fierce, open, and assertive leaders on behalf of our community. I had the chance to be exposed to Jesse Jackson and Harold Washington and a number of leaders like that, who really influenced my sense of myself and my understanding of what I could be, and also my commitment to social justice on behalf of my community, and to try to use whatever platform I had to advance social justice and racial equity. And so I'm really pleased by that, and again, didn't even understand how I was being impacted or influenced, but I'm appreciative that I had the struggles that I did, and I was exposed to the things I was exposed to, because I think it's made me a better person.
Oh, yes. Yes. From you being around your step aunt,
Mm.
sometimes, as you mentioned, that you knew you wanted to be a teacher,
Mm.
but in that moment, you could have seen what she was doing and how that seemed maybe cool or whatever, however you want to. And it just start there and it start to build up and say, you know what, maybe that's something that I want to do. Or maybe she's talking about the students and how she's helping the students. I don't know, but I think sometimes when we're in those environments, it
Right.
will influence us. And normally, when you're around others that are doing something, it doesn't matter what you're doing.
Right.
You may have the same desire just by being in this space. And sometimes we think that we're pursuing this goal because this is something that we thought about ourselves, but we have been influenced by those who have been doing it to some extent. But also when you went on to share that being around the politicians, those who have been making an impact in their communities, I think, as you mentioned, can help to really provide that sense of self, because we really need to know who we are so we can be more impactful, because it stems from you. You want to make sure you are you. When you're out there, you want to be representing yourself well, of course, but it's important that you know yourself and to be around individuals that can help you to develop that sense of self. And as Black men, that's a responsibility that we have, especially with the different challenges that we have personally, but the younger generation have to deal with it as well. So it's on us to help them to develop that sense of self. That means we have to show up as our authentic self and make sure we're not only talking about what we're doing, but also modeling what we're talking about. So you being exposed to those individuals, I think, because I've seen the work that you're doing. And again, as I said earlier, just your dedication to service, to leading the next generation, it is really commendable.
Yeah. And I'll say something else. And you were talking about having that sense of self. I feel like growing up in Chicago in the 70s and even in part of the 80s, that it was acceptable, it was almost required that you have a strong Black consciousness, particularly because of where I was, right? I think Black people that were growing up in maybe the suburbs or other parts of the city may have had a different experience, but when you are surrounded by Black folks who, again, have their struggles, right? And may not in some cases may not survive because of those struggles, but who have a strong sense of Black consciousness. I grew up in a community also where there was a deep connection to the South, Mississippi, and the struggles that we faced in Mississippi. And so I learned a lot about what life was like before and after segregation. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 ended racial segregation in the U.S. And set up a whole chain of events in terms of the Civil Rights Acts and so on. But my folks, grandmother and mother and others included, could talk to me about what it was like to grow up in a segregated community. And while we had challenges in Chicago and there were issues, that there were opportunities that existed there that did not exist for them 30, 40 years prior. And so I understood that. I understood our lineage and how deeply connected we are and how important it was for me to carry that forward.
And what you just said is really important. I saw a picture today, a father passing the world to his child. And so he was teaching all that he have learned, challenges, but as you mentioned, now look at the opportunities that you have that I don't have. And I think that is important, that once you learn it, once you become aware, it's now on us to make sure we pass that information on to the next generation. So not only to prepare them, but to let them know that their options are bigger, or they have more options or more opportunities available to them, which they need to take advantage of. And don't look too much at the challenges itself, because we can get distracted by focusing on the challenges and not focusing on the opportunities that are available to us. And I think you sharing that just bring a great point in, where that's something that we have to become more cognizant of once we're thinking about moving forward.
One other thing I'll say to that point is I think the other thing that I felt a strong sense of, and I think my cousins and other people of my generation felt it too, that we have a responsibility, right, to do something different and do something better than our parents did. And I'm the only one in my family that I know of that has a PhD. So not most people didn't go that route. Yeah. But everybody that I can think of in my generation struggle as we did are all people who are doing good things, right? And living lives that I think we can all say we're proud of, because we understood how important it was that we be responsible for our family, that we be able to take care of our children and our mothers, right? And so I'm really proud of that background and that family history.
Okay, man, and I appreciate that. And that leads to this question. What is your perspective on the current climate of Black men in society today?
The word abysmal comes to mind when you think about the extrajudicial killings, the police shootings. When you think about what is happening in our communities, and if you think about the overall life expectancy for Black men in this nation, it's the lowest of any other group. And when you think about the lack of opportunities that exist for us across multiple spheres, right? And for me, education is the area where I focus, but we can look across all industries, right, and see this. We can see when we talk about dropout in school, we are the bottom usually in terms of performance, in terms of academic achievement and retention. And so in many ways, there's a lot to be concerned about when you think about the overall condition of Black men. And what I have been engaged in, and a number of scholars who work across different fields have been trying to figure out, is how do we erect a movement that looks at our condition in a sort of deep and substantive way, and then advances a vision for how we can be better, how we can be different, and how our life outcomes can shift to a more positive direction. And so for me, that work has been about promoting Black male teachers in the classroom, because what we know is that if students have teachers that look like them, that they have commonalities with, that they actually perform better. There's research that shows that African American children who have at 3 African American teachers before they leave high school, that they have considerably better academic outcomes than those who do not, right? And so having a Black teacher makes a difference in the lives of students. And so for me, that is the part that I try to play in terms of turning this thing around, because we know that if you don't get an education, or if you leave school woefully underprepared, your chances of going to jail are higher than they are of going to college, right? And so we're trying to shift that trajectory so that kids are turned on by education, that kids want to go to school, they want to stay in school, they graduate, and they go on to either higher education or trade school, but something that leads them to a sort of positive occupational choice for a career where they can be active contributors to their community. And there's way too many of us that are not able to do that because of the lack of opportunity that exists in these communities, but also because of racism and the kind of discrimination that we experience at multiple levels. I think it also has to do with the fact that we haven't successfully figured out how to use whatever wealth we may have gained individually to come together to support those who are still struggling, and to help create a pathway to success for those who are locked out of opportunity.
And again, well said. And you have shared a lot that we need to really think about, from using our resources and what we have to deal with. And it goes back to what you played a role in the classroom, but goes back to where we take the responsibility, but also where we have to realize our resources and how we're going to use that resource, or the resources that we have, to help move the needle forward. Because I think it was W.E. Du Bois that talks about the talented 10th. And we are now more than 10% of our race that are successful. And when he mentioned that, the 10% was to help to liberate us. So we have to utilize the resources that we have to mobilize change. And as you mentioned, we may not have figured that out yet, but I think that's going to be one of the best way to move forward, because we do need resources. We do need the support. We do need to fill those opportunity gaps and the wealth gaps and stuff like that. But if we don't have those options, we may stay stuck and can get discouraged.
Yep.
So those with the resources have to see it fit to help mobilize the change that is going to put us in a better position to change the narrative.
The other really important issue is around our own consciousness of who we are, right? are issues of self-hate. And you talk about Black men and the condition of Black men. It pains me, and as I'm sure it does you, as a person trying to do this work to advance the cause and the situation of Black men, to see Black men on television and on social media describing Black women in very negative ways, and talking about their preference for other women, which I don't hate on anybody for preferring somebody of another race. But if that's about you hating Black people, right, then we have a problem with that. And so this sense of self-hate that I think drives all the killing, right, the Black on Black crime. You hear how we talk about each other, right? It's something we have to look at. We have to look at our own lack of consciousness about who we are, where we come from, and why it's important that we not only survive but thrive. And it's normal in a white supremacist society for people who are the victims of white supremacy to hate themselves. In fact, that is what is expected. That is what all of this is about, right? These institutions, as they are constructed, are really constructed against you and against your Blackness. And so we have to fight against that subconsciously, but also actively, so that we can develop a consciousness of self-love and a commitment to advancing our people. And so that's just as important as all the other things I talked about. And I would say, some people would say that, yeah, poor folks need that. I think everybody needs that. Some of our most wealthy people need that too, right? Because some of us have made it and been successful because we hate ourselves, and we get rewarded for that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
right. And so this is not about class. I think this issue of consciousness, you can see for us across the classes, and we need to somehow find a way to educate ourselves about who we are before we can really do the work that you and I are talking about.
Well, and self-help, self-love is really critical in moving forward. We must love ourselves if we're going to create a change. And we must love ourselves to the point that certain things we no longer will condone, either from others or from ourselves. Mm-hmm. And not until we reach that point. And it doesn't have to be everyone, but it needs to be enough where it becomes evident that we no longer hate ourselves. People are going to be in situations, of course, but it should be so evident that anyone can see the change that we're making towards ourselves. And I think that is important as we move forward, as we focus on changing the narrative, as we focus on helping the next generation to be better than we are today.
Yes.
And so that leads me to this question. And I think you may have touched on it a little bit with the response you just gave. But what change do you want to see in general and amongst Black men?
Yeah, that self-love piece is critical, right? And that commitment to advancing our community has to be a shared thing.
Okay.
You know, I'm an educator, so I think a lot of the problems can be solved by education, and maybe that's a limited and narrow view, but that's my history. I'm an educator. So as we were talking about consciousness, for example, I started thinking about literature, readings, right, that reflect who we are in a positive light, that tells the real story about our history, not just from slavery, but going back to Africa, right?
Yeah.
And you have to understand that we sometimes get into this thing about, oh, you're Caribbean, you're African, and I'm American, and we're different, and we're not the same. But that's a person who doesn't understand their history, right? That if you're Caribbean and the other person's American, that's just about where the boat stopped, right?
That's right.
that is, and that difference is a constructed difference, and those differences between us were played up and highlighted, right? So that we would, again, not come together.
Yeah.
And so if you understand the history, so education is important and necessary so that we understand who we are, where we come from, and where we might go. And so if I had it my way, I would start a broad education campaign for Black people, when you're talking Black males, from very early on, preschool all the way up, right? In terms of helping people understand who they are and seeing themselves in a positive light, right? and getting rid of all the negative images that pervade our consciousness. When I was a teacher in New York City while I was going to school at Columbia, I had a couple of African-American male children in my class who were known to be what the other educators call bad children. And what I discovered about those young men at the age of 7 and 8, or 8 and 9, was that they had internalized the fear that white people had of them. And they walk, and these are kids who are 8, 9, are already pretty big, right? And so they go into a store, they come into school, wherever they go, people are fearful of them.
Wow.
People are thinking that they're going to steal and all that. And so what they learned to do was to take that on, right? If that's who you think I am, then that's who I'm going to be. And when I started to help my students understand that that's an external representation of you, that is not actually who you are. That's what they're putting onto you. You don't have to own it. You can reject it, right? And I introduced them to stories on the lives of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and we also talked about slavery and introduced them to that history. And so they began to develop a consciousness about who they were in the world that wasn't dependent on what white folks or anybody else was doing in response or reaction to them. And so that education for me is so critical for us in terms of who we are, what our history is, where we come from. And then I would say we have to learn how to also be in healthy relationship with one another. And then we have to be intentional about ensuring that we do that. For me, was my boys, I have 3 young men, and there was a lot of emphasis in my household on making sure that they could communicate with each other well and respectfully, right? That you're not going to call your brother names. You will not raise your hand to your brother, right? We don't do that. And so I laid down an expectation for how they would relate to each other. And today, those 3 guys are all very close, right? And even if they get into disagreements, they're not unmanageable, right? They don't become violent, because it just was not the way they were taught. They were taught that you must respect and value your brother. You must speak to your brother with kindness. And if your brother says something to you that you don't like, tell him in a kind way, right? But violence will not be an acceptable way to deal with any problems or challenges. And so I think the education, I think that relational piece is also important. And there are lots and lots of other elements that I could talk about, but those would be the 2 that if I had a magic wand and could say, how am I going to change the condition of Black males, I'd start there. Of course, the word reparations comes to mind, right? I've been fortunate to be able to raise my children in a household with access to things and to resources. A lot of Black men don't have that opportunity because I would argue that they're locked out of those opportunities. And that's historical. That our labor from slavery, and I would argue colonialism in many parts of the world, right? That our people labored to construct what is now the U.S., what is now Jamaica, and if you go to Ghana, you see the same thing there, right? Under colonial, our people built those structures and built those societies and got nothing in return. And so I believe that we need to be thinking about a reparations movement, and not just for people who were formerly enslaved. I think people who were colonized. And see, some people have slavery and colonization, right? So there are 2 different ways in which I think we need to think about that. And the way in which not only were our resources taken and stolen from us, we were locked out of opportunities to advance our people. And so I think we need to be thinking about that, because without the economic aspect of things, it's going to be really hard for us to bring ourselves out of the condition that we find ourselves in globally. Again, some of us have managed to sort of work through it and find success, but that isn't the vast majority of us. And that I think the vast majority of us are still, challenged. And I think we've got to find a way to work through that. And for me, it is about, those reparations, and we can talk about what in what form, right? Because I think there are many forms that could take. But Well, when I look at, I can trace back one segment of my family back to slavery, and it's 14 people that are all part of one family on my mom's side. And if I were to calculate the wages that those people were owed over the roughly 50-year period that they were enslaved by this family, it'd be in the millions, right? And that's just for one segment. So think about what it would be for if I looked at all segments and if we all began to look at that. I mean, it would be incalculable, probably, what we're owed. And not just from the family members or the families who held our folks in bondage, but also from the cities, from the states, from the businesses that built the slave ships, all of that, right? We have to look to in terms of thinking about how to improve our economic condition in this country, but I think across the world.
And again, you have shared a lot of information that we need to think about, and really good information from how we, the change that we need to make where you said relationship and education, but also the repatriation, where will help us to advance based on what our ancestors had to go through to advance or develop the wealth for the country and stuff like that, where we didn't get to participate in the wealth creation. And it affects us today. And again, it affects men a lot more because a few years ago when I was teaching a social problem class, the title of the book, well, not the book itself, but one of the chapters, it says overburdened women and displaced men. So the men weren't able to find opportunities, and women were overburdened because they had a lot more to do because they weren't getting the help from the male. And again, it goes back to not having the opportunities or get shut out of the opportunities out there and stuff like that. So having that repatriation could be a thing that can help to advance our cause, to make a difference within our communities and help to close that financial gap and even opportunity gaps and stuff like that. So I've been hearing conversations around it and how they're planning on doing it, but I haven't really focused a lot on the topic of repatriation and stuff like that still. But I think with the wealth and displacement of Black people within the country, I think it would be a great thing for us as we move forward.
I agree.
So let me go into my next question. And you may have touched this already. It's a real simple question, but what was a pivotal moment in your life?
Probably the birth of my first son. almost 21 years ago now. Yeah, it was incredible. And then to see the resemblance, and then to see these kids, they come out with pieces of you, right, and your personality and all of that. So that was a pivotal moment for me, was the birth of my first son. And then of course the birth of my other two sons were equally pivotal.
Okay, great. So my next question is, what life lesson have you learned late in life that you believe is important and that is beneficial to this current generation?
Well, I did say this earlier, that I am not a patient person.
Yeah.
And I have been known to be impatient, right? And what I have found is that that is a quality that I've had to work on, and I've had to work toward being patient and being a little less in a hurry, I guess, to do things, and understanding that it takes time for things. And that's something I've learned late in life. Even I can think of some experiences I had fairly recently where I thought, yeah, if you had been more patient, you probably would have been more successful with that project and with that thing that you were trying to do. I think the other thing I've learned is while it's important to share your opinion, it is also equally important to listen and to understand where you are and the context in which you're trying to do something, because you can make a lot of mistakes early on by communicating maybe more than you need to before you have the opportunity to actually make a difference. And that's I think a lesson late in life. I'm a person, as you see, can talk, right?
Yes.
And so I've learned to be more of a listener, and to also ask for help when I need it, and to be grateful,
Yes.
to say thank you to people who are helping me, and to try to have a positive outlook on life, even when things are looking not so good. So those are the lessons and that I've learned. I think kind of late in life, I didn't always see things that way.
I think those are really great, especially patience. And
Yeah,
also make sure you don't say too much, especially when you want to make an impact. Because although it goes back to what you shared, from our perspective as Black men, we may see the need, but
right.
those who are around us may not see the need because they may not have experienced it. And by
Right.
you sharing it, they may take it a wrong way
Yeah.
and say, you know what, we're not going to work with this. This is not what we want. So
Right.
let's try to stop this. But if you have learned earlier, just this is just for us, even myself too, learned earlier that sometimes keep back on what are some of the changes you want, because everybody may not see things the same way. You know,
Right.
get yourself cemented first and
Right.
then create those changes. So it is something I believe those two especially really worth practicing or becoming aware of, being
Yes.
patient, and sometimes listen more than you say, especially when you don't understand the environment in which you are,
Right.
stuff like that. So
Right.
I believe
One other thing that you made me think about, and I'll say this real quick. It's not always about you.
that's right. That's right.
I, I mean, I know we can take things very personally, and I know I can. And if something doesn't go our way, we think, oh, that's personal. You're doing that because you don't like me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I've had to tell myself over and over again, nope, not about me. That sometimes there are conditions and situations that you find yourself in that are just the way that they are, and they would be that way even if you were not there,
Okay.
right? And so if you're in a situation where you feel like people may be reacting negatively, or maybe you're not having the kind of success that you want to have, a lot of times that has to do with the structure of that space and the way it's been set up, right? And you have to work against that and understand that it's not about you, and that you may have to be part of a change process that is really more about changing the structure to create opportunities for you and others to be successful.
That is so true. That is, it's not about you. And Black men, sometimes we can be in situations or environment that will resist what we're trying to do. And
Right.
yes, we may take it personal, but we have to understand and that it's not always about us per se. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that is worth knowing and becoming aware of. Because again, we're going to be in situations where people may challenge you or challenge us as we try to make a difference. So I think that is really important and a great reminder. So my before I ask my final question, where can the listeners find you and help support the great work that you're doing?
So I'm at the University of Colorado, Denver, and if you go to that website, you'll find me there. If you do a Google search for me, you'll find me there. You can also find probably my Gmail address on there. And so universities are challenged today, particularly public universities, particularly urban public universities like the University of Colorado, Denver. And there are a number of other public urban universities I can name. But we really need a broad base of support from our community. We need folks to really take an interest in what it is we're trying to do. We need to be able to connect with community so that we can craft a vision for our institution that aligns with where our communities want to go. I think the chancellor here has done that to a great extent. What I'm hoping to see is the development of that relationship with community alongside that vision so that we can really think about where we go next. But so I would say that's the support we need. Is we need partnership with community, and we need to be able to work together to advance a common cause.
Okay. So thanks for sharing that. And I will also put in the description a link to your social media so they can continue the conversation. And if
Yeah.
someone is listening and want to support your program or the school itself, they can reach out to you from your connection in the description. But thanks for sharing that with the listeners. and I know they will want to continue the conversation to some extent. So my final question to you is, what impact do you want to have on the world?
Again, for me, it is about education, and that's my lane. And I'm going to stick to it until I decide I'm going to retire and not do this anymore. I think for me, the reason why I'm in higher education, the reason why I'm in leadership in higher education is because I want to transform how folks are prepared to teach, lead, counsel, and work with our children, right? And I say our children, I mean Black children, but I mean all children, because I think all children need to be educated in a different way and taught, and principals need to be prepared differently, superintendents, and so on. And so for me, it's about transforming the field of education to be more inclusive, to be more focused and centered on equity issues, but also to be committed to advancing diversity. And so if I can impact my field in that way, then I feel like I will have done my part. Certainly, I want to be involved in broader social movements beyond education. And so I am engaged on boards. I've served, for example, on a hospital board and other types of boards that get me involved in different aspects, right, beyond just my field, to be able to make a difference at that level. As a member of a hospital board, I was involved in helping doctors look at the treatment, right, of African American, Latinx, and Indigenous patients, and helping to develop a system that was going to be focused on creating equitable health outcomes. And so we can be involved in multiple ways in advancing change on behalf of our communities through not just our work, right, our primary work, but also through boards and other associations. I'm also very much involved in church, and so in advancing and connecting, connecting the church leaders to children, particularly African Americans who need support, who need book bags, those kinds of things. And so I just plan to stay engaged at multiple levels and trying to advance change in whatever way that I can. But education is the primary way that I hope to be able to do that.
Okay. And that's great. And education is always important. And well, everybody have to go through that system. Education. It doesn't matter what field you're in. You have to go through the education system. So, Dr. Lynn, man, this conversation has been great. You have shared a wealth of knowledge, and I know the listeners will be appreciative of the knowledge and perspective that you have shared with us today. So, Dr. Lynn, thanks for being here on the Black Male Impact.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and listeners, as always, our goal is to inspire positive change. Thanks for listening. The Black Male Impact.